G'day, welcome to the Random Subject channel. Here I'm going to delve into whatever random subject comes into my head. We'll see how we go. Today I'm going to look at something that's dear to a lot of people's hearts, including mine, coffee. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Don't be an idiot. You're a nobody YouTuber. You don't have a sponsor.
Let's edit that out.
Let's say it up front. I'm an Australian, and Australia is getting famously, or infamously known for high quality, demanding, trendy, hipster coffee consumers. Yep, coffee is ingrained in the culture of Australia now, probably due to the number of Italian immigrants after World War II. So when an Aussie like me ends up in a country that's not Australia and wants a coffee, there's only one real choice available, and it's not going to the local coffee shop to sample the swill they serve, to sample what passes for coffee here. Have to make it yourself. So, what are the options? Instant? Yeah, okay, definitely not an option. Plunger? Better option, but I've found it's generally not the strongest coffee and can sometimes spurt hot, groundy water all over you if you overload the plunger. Something easy enough to do, and it leaves a clog of coffee grounds at the bottom of the pot. How about pod machines? Better, yes, especially when it comes to cleaning up, but it can be hit and miss on quality, and of course does have the environmental problems around disposal of so many pods, something that had caused the inventor of the coffee pod to regret ever having come up with the idea. The good old drip filter? Well, I'm not experienced in this one, but TV and movies are rife with those that show coffee that has been brewing around for hours on end, and that is just a recipe for really bad coffee. For me, there's only one option, the mocha pot, sometimes known as the Italian percolator pot. This has to be the best of all worlds. A coffee made at home, but the brewing process is done in a similar overall manner to those super expensive machines you see at your local coffee shop. Most important here, it's not just the mocha pot, but also using freshly ground coffee, as in just done a minute ago, and not pre-ground coffee you've just bought. This is important as roasted coffee beans, and in particular ground coffee beans, react with the air to change the taste, and not for the better. There are ways to reduce or prevent this problem, but that's something we can go over once I've showed you the ins and outs of using a mocha pot.
Now before we make our coffee, let me just run you through how a mocha pot works. It's divided into three sections. On the bottom is the reservoir. This is where your water goes in that's going to be doing the brewing process. Next up in the middle is our coffee ground basket. And screwing into the top is the pot itself where your brewed coffee will end up in.
So the reservoir is filled up with water, and the basket gets the coffee grounds. You put the basket into the reservoir and then screw the top section of the pot onto the reservoir. Once it's tightly screwed up, you put it onto the stove where the water gets heated up and it starts to boil. The steam generated from some of the boiling water generates pressure in the reservoir and forces the water up through the basket. That's through the coffee grounds for the brewing process, and from there passes up a tube and into the top of the mocha pot. And hey presto, you have coffee.
Okay, first up is the coffee beans. You're going to want to do them at roughly a medium grind.
Pretty well all of what you'll find on your supermarket shelf though is finely ground coffee, and that's not really suitable here for a couple of reasons. One reason is the time it takes for the hot water to pass through the coffee grinds. If your local coffee shop barista is doing their job properly, they're adjusting the courses of the grind, as the best tasting coffee should be done within a certain time window. If the process is too quick, then it's weak and watery. If it's too long, it's not just too strong, but fairly bitter. And while coffee should have a bite to it, it should not be bitter. For a mocha pot, a medium grind should do the job properly, but this is something you can experiment with. Another reason is if the grind is too fine, it will make passing water through it too hard, and that can have catastrophic results. Something I'm going to show you about in a minute. Now, as you see here, I'm using a manual grinder. I recommend you get an electric one. They're a little bit noisier, but it's so much easier. Now, once your coffee grinding is done, fill the lower part of the mocha pot with hot or even boiling water up to the pressure valve. This should fill most of the reservoir, but not completely. Too much water here can have those catastrophic results I hinted at. Starting with hot water is going to speed up the boiling process, and after all, we want coffee, and we want it now. Next, add your freshly ground coffee into the basket. At this point, it's super important not to compact the grounds down to fit into the basket. If there's too many grounds, that's fine. Just fill up the basket as much as you can and level the grounds off without patting them down. You remember when I mentioned those catastrophic results? Coffee grounds that are too fine or compacted down, or worse, both, will slow down the passage of your hot water through them. That means pressure is going to build up without really getting released. That little safety valve on the side does work, but you can overload it, and yes, it can cause the mocha pot to explode. Yep, that did happen to me. Also, make sure to clear those excess coffee grounds off the rim of the basket. This means that when you put the whole thing together, you end up with a good seal between the basket and the silicone ring inside the top of the pot. Once you put the grounds in the basket, put the basket into its place on the reservoir. Screw the top part in place and turn your stove onto a medium heat. Medium heat. It's very important. You don't have a lot of water here, so don't heat it up too quickly. Remember explosions. The water will boil, go through the brewing process I talked about earlier, and once your mocha pot is giving a bubbling steaming sound, you're all done. Take it off the stove and run the base under some water for a couple of seconds. This is going to slightly cool down the remaining water and steam in the reservoir, stopping the brewing process. Now, while we wanted the hot water to go through the coffee grounds, we do not want steam, as it's going to give a burned and bitter taste to the coffee. Now, the serving is going to be to your taste, but I do like using a specialty milk frother for that authentic cafe taste. It heats up the milk so the coffee isn't cooled down and adds those all-important air bubbles. Don't know why the air bubbles are important, they just work. Mine's a Lavazza, which was given to me as a Christmas present here, but there are heaps of these sorts of things out there.
Now, one last thing is the storage of your coffee beans. This should be done in a vacuum sealed container, not just airtight.
The idea is to use the pump to remove as much air as possible from the container to stop the coffee beans from turning bitter by reacting with the oxygen in the air. Take the air out from the container and your coffee beans will stay tasty for much longer.
So that's it. All you need to do now is sit back and enjoy your tasty, freshly brewed coffee. Ciao. But before we make the coffee, I'll quickly run quickly starting to sound like bloomin' Cumberbatch saying penguins. At the bottom, you have the reservoir. This is where your water goes in, and I'm looking at my screen and not at the camera. And stop looking at the screen, look at the lens. What are you doing laughing while I'm in the middle of a take?